we're going to get to all sorts of things today, but Rick Pender's with us. We're going to get into why he's so passionate about the awesome city that we love of Cincinnati. We just happen to be sitting in northern Kentucky, but you know a little something about northern Kentucky history as well.
I've spent some time here too.
Right? And but there's some books, a book you wrote in 2021, but today we're really going to be talking about 100 things to do in Cincinnati before we die. Before we die, why do we have to end the book title in that, Rick?
Well, it's not the title that I would have chosen, but my publisher has done these books for over 100 cities, and that's the title that they use, exchanging the name of the city for whoever's writing it and wherever they are.
How'd you end up being the Cincinnati guy if they've done 100 of them?
I think that I got called upon. They were hunting around for somebody who knew some stuff about Cincinnati. I think they talked to somebody at the Convention and Visitors Bureau who was an old acquaintance of mine, and she said, "Oh, you should talk to Rick. He's tapped into a lot of this kind of stuff." And I'd spent some years at CityBeat newspaper as the arts and entertainment editor, so I sort of had a foundation to build on, and that's how I started doing that.
Was all the stuff about our city that we'll get into, was it already in your head, or did you have to go deep in to do more research when they came to you?
I'll tell you what I did to get started on these books was that I just sort of brainstormed a list of stuff that I thought might be worth including. And my list had 200 things on it. So then I had to narrow it down. So that first book came out in 2016 and did quite well. And 3 years later, they asked me to do a second edition. And about a quarter of the material needed to be refreshed, a few things replaced, that sort of thing. And that book came out right at the end of 2019, right before the pandemic. Not a great time to be putting out a book about things to do, because most of what we did was sit at home. But that's been out there now for 3 years. And they came back to me again and said, "You ready to do another edition?" And I said, yeah, because there's even more that needs to be not just refreshed, but replaced. So this new one is about a third of the material is going to be brand new.
So what are some of the significant things that are new that are in the most recent update?
Well, a lot of restaurant stuff changed. And, restaurants really had a hard time coming through the pandemic. A lot of them didn't come through the pandemic. So that would be probably the most changes that I had to make was in the food and drink section in here. In addition to the fact that our area is doing a great job with launching new restaurants and new breweries and all of those kinds of things, and I wanted to keep it as up-to-date as I could. So I would say those are the areas where there was particular change.
Is there a significant reason why our region, Cincinnati region, has done well with restaurants and breweries? Do you think?
Well, I think on the brewery side, we have a lot of history here. Those Germans brought their beer making here a century and a half ago, and it went away for a while, but it's come back blockbuster now. So, I think that's part of it. But the food scene is a little different. I came to Cincinnati in 1980, and there were some great restaurants here, but I wouldn't say we had a food scene. And I think that there are a couple of things that have happened that have changed that. One was a couple of celebrity chefs who were here in town who really mentored other people and gave them the motive and the experience to start their own. And then a couple of training programs. Cincinnati State has a culinary training program, and that a lot of people started there and really were able to launch from there. I'm also familiar with there's like a sort of a test kitchen at Findlay Market, and that has been a place where a lot of people have sort of tried out ideas, been able to sort of get a foot in the door with that kind of thing, and then launch from there.
Do you have any favorites? Any restaurants? I'm not as much of a foodie as I should be. Is there one or two that really stands out as significant and neat and exciting to you?
Yeah, I will point out one. I mean, I could give you 20. But the one that will be in the book that was not in the prior one is the one called Pep and Dolores, which is on Vine Street in OTR. It's part of that Thunderdome group. I mean, and I guess that maybe that's another factor. A couple of people who've been successful with the launch of one or two things have then become a group and have launched more. And so, but Thunderdome and Pep and Dolores, it's a sort of it's an Italian restaurant, but it sort of feels like something that could have been there forever because they use a lot of their recipes from family and things like that. It's a beautiful physical space, and it's not always easy to get a seat there these days. The food is a great place, great bar. They make their own limoncello there. It's just a great stop in over the Rhine.
On the 100 things to do before we die, if I went out and said, hey, me and my significant other, I said, hey, let's go do these 100 things, how long would it take me?
Well, I caution people about doing that because once you've done 100, maybe you have to die. So be careful. Be careful what you wish for.
99 then.
Yeah, 99. I would say that, if you had nothing else, if you didn't have daily employment and that sort of thing, and you did something every day, you could probably do it in 6 months. Oh. But most of it is sort of within the Beltway. I've got a few things out and beyond to the north or the south in particular. And I think I've got the Kentucky Horse Park as a place to visit. And I've got a couple of restaurants that are further up north. So, there's some of those. But most of it you could easily get to in a half-a-day drive, if not less. So you could do it in a 6-month period.
So if there were, how many of these books did they do you know, around the country?
The last time that I checked, there were 138.
So do you know the ratings of those? Are you a competitive person? Like, where did Cincinnati's 100 Things to Do compare to other cities?
I don't know that, but I know that the fact that they've had me do a third edition means that it has sold well, whereas some of the others that came out around the time of my first one, it's still the first edition. Things don't change as much in some of the smaller cities and that sort of thing.
I'm wondering, it feels, I've touched on this a few times, it feels like we're really proud of our hometown. I know you moved here in 1980. Does it feel like is it home to you now?
Oh, absolutely.
It seems like we're more of a homer than the average person in a lot of cities. There's a lot of people that spend their entire lives here, generations deep. Yeah. It's not a transient city as much, which is fascinating because wasn't there a time when Cincinnati was a top 5 city in the country?
Oh, yeah, back in the 19th century. We were probably in about the 1850s, we were about the 4th largest city in the country. So, yeah, that was the case. So, but, I think it is an interesting combination of two things you just mentioned. One is that we've got people who've been here for generations, and of course they're proud of the city. But we also have people who come here, they're transient, but maybe they end up staying, like me, because they really like it. And, we've got these big companies here like Procter and GE and Kroger and some of those. They bring people here from all over the world. I'm sure that some of those people say, Cincinnati, what's going to be in Cincinnati for me? And they come here and find out that we've got professional sports, we've got great arts, it's a beautiful place physically, cost of living is pretty reasonable, and a lot of those people stick here. So, I think it's a combination, and I think that it's some of those people that have taught the people who are lifelong residents that this is something to be proud of. And I think through the late 20th century, I used to feel like people had a inferiority complex about Cincinnati. They were always wishing they could be some other city. Gee, I wish we were more like Austin or more like Portland, Oregon. I don't hear people saying that much anymore. In fact, I think there's a lot of people in other places who are saying, at Cincinnati, they've got their act together.
Yeah, do you think it's is it just almost that we're maybe the perfect size population of a city?
I think so. It makes it a very manageable city. It's big enough to have things like professional sports, but it's a physically sort of compact area. I mean, our downtown is only about a square mile. You can walk from one corner to the other in less than an hour. Mm-hmm. So, we've got that. We've got a lot of great history and that sort of thing. So I think all those factors really work. The fact that we were the first inland city in the country meant that a lot of people came here from elsewhere, and so we've got history that goes back actually into the 18th century.
So you're a unique person / character. You are very passionate about the arts, and at the same time passionate about sports. It seems that's unique. That I think we all say, "Oh, we like listening to music, or we can go to a theater, or we can go to the Playhouse, or we're a really hardcore sports fan, and we can go to a game." But you seem to have deep passions around both.
I do. I think that I would, if I had to rank them, I'd put the arts above sports. But I love sports. And I grew up near Cleveland. I'll tell you that much now.
I'm sorry.
And, don't be sorry, because I still love Cleveland. I mean, I think that Ohio is a great state. It's got cities that are quite different from one another, and they're Ohio's a state to be proud of because it's got a lot going for it. But so I grew up there, but I came here. I fell in love with the city. I've never in 43 years thought about living anywhere else. It's really the place, because I came here initially to work for WGUC, the classical music radio station, and that dipped me into the arts so quickly that I really fell in love with them. That was a time not too long after the Big Red Machine had done pretty well, and so the Reds had some good teams through the 80s. Not so much recently, but they were fun to watch, and it was always fun to go to a Reds game. And then I learned about the history of the Reds. The oldest professional baseball team in the country. So that was kind of fun. Sports, I'm afraid I rooted for the Browns for an awful long time, but got a little more passionate about the Bengals in the 80s when they made it to the Super Bowl twice. Then we had a long dry period there, and then but we're back again, and back again better than ever probably. And I still would love to see my Cleveland Browns do well, but it's going to be a while before that happens. And in the meantime, I can't think of a better city to be in than Cincinnati, with Joe Burrow quarterbacking that team. And, they just seem to be doing all the right things.
The next decade as a Bengals fan is going to be fun, I think.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, it doesn't matter what's going to come, because he went down with the ACL injury and had that problem and came right back and better than ever.
Yeah.
It's fun. Yeah, the Reds what do you think the issue is with baseball? Is it this is it not having the salary cap? Is it, or they do have a cap, but then they just have to pay all this? Yeah, it's dominated by these huge city teams.
Yeah.
And they have so much money, I guess, because of their TV deals, because of their marketplace. And it just seems to be a small market baseball team. It is just really tough to compete because you only have the money to pay like one or two big stars.
Yeah.
And these other teams have five.
Yeah.
Is that going to be something that you think
I think it's going to be an ongoing issue, but I will. The Cleveland Guardians, as we have to call them now, had a great team last year with a lot of young players. So I think it can be done. It requires pretty savvy management to be able to put together things like that, and I haven't seen that happen here for a while. I don't want to be critical of the team. I mean, I think it's a crapshoot trying to run a sports franchise regardless. And I think they've tried to do a lot of the right things, but right now they seem to, every time they cultivate talent, then they let them slip away. And I wish that wasn't happening.
What makes it special about attending a baseball game?
There's something about the pace of baseball. I know that this year with all the new rules that they're trying to speed the game up a little bit, but there's something, it's sort of leisurely. When years and years ago, I was getting a graduate degree in English literature, and I got stuck with teaching freshman composition. And I did my best to try to make it interesting for the students, and we had a book of essays that they could read, and there was one that was called Football Red, Baseball Green, and it talked about how football was about warfare, whereas baseball was more like leisurely out in the pasture, having a good time. And I think that's part of it. I mean, we want our teams to be feisty and competitive, but I think that there's something about that big grassy green field and watching people chase down balls and stuff like that. I mean, it feels a little bit old-fashioned, but then we've got a team that got those old-fashioned roots, so maybe that's part of it too. I think that many baseball teams, and I've been to ballparks around the country, do great things to try to pick up on the nostalgia of the sport. It certainly has a different draw than football does. I mean, football really is about combat, and for better or worse, sometimes I think. We saw some pretty scary things happen during the Bengals season. As good as the team was, you really have to stop and think, about that. But I think that going to a baseball game, it's something you take the family to. Fans don't get quite as nutty as they do at football, so there's some big differences there.
It seems like the NFL is just our iteration of a Roman Coliseum.
Yeah, very much so.
Right, disappointing at times,
right. But it's fun. And when your team are the winning gladiators, then you feel pretty good about it.
Yeah. So. What was so inspiring in 1980 when you came here, and you came for the classical exposure experience in the educational field? What was, we had the Cincinnati Symphony, we had a lot of it seemed, I was young then, it seemed like it was a very art-centered city, but what was it to you in 1980?
Well, because I was working at that radio station, it really was sort of being quickly immersed in the arts. I mean, our studios were right across the street from Music Hall, and so a lot of times on a Friday morning, I could go over and sit through a concert, and that was pretty impressive. I did my undergraduate degree at Oberlin College up in northern Ohio, which has a fabulous music conservatory, so I'd always enjoyed being around and able to go to concerts and hear things. I'm not musical myself. I don't play an instrument. I don't sing, but I can really appreciate that. So the amount of music here was a big difference. But my other serious passion in the arts is theater, and I came here, and within a week of starting at WGUC, somebody invited me to go to the Playhouse to see a show, and I went there and I thought, wow, this is fabulous. Now, I lived near Cleveland. Cleveland has the Cleveland Playhouse, which is a real historic theater, and they do great work, but I'd gone maybe twice in my growing up years, because I sort of lived out in the country, not right in the city. It was a little harder to get to. It wasn't in a great neighborhood. And but here, there's the Playhouse in the Park, a playhouse in the park. That's kind of an unusual concept. It was a beautiful setting there. And I started going regularly because I worked in the media. I got invites to a lot of things. And then later in the 80s, I started reviewing theater. I worked at WNKU, the public radio station at Northern Kentucky University, and I started doing reviews on the air of the theater that I would see the night before. I'd just go in the morning and talk about what I saw last night. And when I left there, then I found print outlets that I could write things for. So I've been passionate particularly about theater for years. There wasn't a lot of it here in the 80s. In the 90s, it began to pick up, and we now have a really vibrant theater scene. Mm-hmm. So you put that together with our more historic arts, like the symphony, like the May Festival, like the opera, and it's an incredible combination of attractions that are all world class in what they offer. They and people who come here from elsewhere say, I had no idea that, I could find arts that don't cost an arm and a leg to go to and are easy to get a subscription to, and you can go and there's parking nearby and it doesn't cost a fortune. So, it really is a pretty remarkable combination of things that I think draws people to the city and sets us apart from many other cities.
What's special about the theater to you?
I guess maybe it's two things. One is that it's storytelling, and I love being able to go and sort of meet people. Meet the stories of people that I'm interested in. But it's also because it's a live art. You are in the theater with people who are acting, playing roles, but you're not, you're 20 or 30 feet away from them. You're connecting with them in those ways. And there are so many different ways that stories can be told. I love, because I have an academic background, I love to go to the Cincinnati Shakespeare Company, where they do really seriously classic work. But then I like to go to other places. I love musical comedy, and I've done a lot of writing about Stephen Sondheim, who's the musical theater composer and lyricist. And CCM trains kids to go to Broadway. They've got a great musical theater training program there. So I mean, during the height of my work for CityBeat, I was probably over the course of a given year seeing 90 or 100 productions a year. And that's like, maybe twice, 3 times a week. Sometimes that got ramped up a little bit because I'd go to a theater festival somewhere and I might see 7 or 8 shows over a week's time. But it was a lot. And I still go to see most of the work at our major theaters here in town. And it's for those reasons, that storytelling and the connection that you make.
When you walk out of a theater, those moments when you've been really impacted, what happened? What happened then?
I guess I would say they would be stories that really made me either transported me to something that I didn't know anything about, or that I learned something that was perhaps an element in my life that I could relate to. I mean, it sort of goes both ways, depending on the work, the medium that they are using. Is it music, or is it spoken word? Is it the scenery? Is it the lighting? All of those kinds of things just have a tremendous impact. So it's often a combination of many of those kinds of things. But I can't point to any. I mean, I can point out productions that I've seen.
Is that why the West Side Story made such an impact with you?
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. That's one that I saw first as a movie before I knew it as a stage play. But, I was a teenager when I learned about that and loved the music from it. First LP I ever bought was the soundtrack from that movie. And I didn't even know that Stephen Sondheim wrote the words for it. He was 25 years old when he did that, and he was not famous at that point in his career. But as time went on and I found out more and more about shows that he had done, then I realized that it was those words that he wrote. It's often the words, because my own background is more in literature and writing than it is in, I love music, but I'm not trained in it. So it tends to be the words that I am drawn to in theater, poetry, novels, all of those kinds of things.
Do you think that combination of Bernstein and Sondheim and the West Side Story, the music and the lyrics, is that come together for a special combination?
It did, but I don't know that you know this, but Stephen Sondheim wasn't wildly enthusiastic about doing that. Mm-hmm. He wanted to write the music and the lyrics, which is what he did for most of his career. He did West Side Story as the lyricist, and he did Gypsy with Julie Stein as the composer for that, because Ethel Merman was the star of that show, and she didn't want some punky young composer doing music, because she'd just done a show with a couple of young composers who didn't quite cut the mustard for her. So he was put forward as perhaps doing that. And she said, no, I've got to have somebody who's got a track record. And Julie Stein was a great composer. He and Sondheim ended up working together very happily and comfortably, as did Sondheim and Bernstein on West Side Story. And he learned a lot from doing it. Interesting part of those two shows is that Sondheim was mentored by Oscar Hammerstein, as in Rodgers and Hammerstein. Sondheim was a teenager when his parents split up. His mom moved out into the country in Pennsylvania. There were farms nearby, and Oscar Hammerstein had a farm like right next door. And so Steve started hanging out there and became enamored of musical theater. So Hammerstein, once Sondheim began to really show professional interest, would go to Hammerstein for advice, and Hammerstein said to him, you need to get experience wherever you can. So when he had this opportunity to work with Leonard Bernstein and Arthur Lawrence and Jerome Robbins on that show, those guys were all big names in theater already. He said, all right, I'll do it. He and Bernstein didn't always agree on he thought that Leonard Bernstein did too much in what he called purple prose. It was too flowery and that sort of thing, and he wanted to write stuff that was more economical. But he figured out how to make it work, and then he got to work on Gypsy. But in both of those cases, Hammerstein said to him, "Oh, Steve, you're going to work with great people. It's going to lay a great foundation." Now, that's about the last time that he did that. He did one show with Richard Rodgers in the mid-'60s after Hammerstein passed away, and it wasn't a very happy or successful experience, and that's about the only thing beyond that. Before that, he did Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is still a great, funny farce of a musical, and then beyond that point, he really launched into a great career where he was doing music and lyrics.
What's funny is the advice that he received to go get experience, and when you gain experience, you're around other people who have come before you.
Yeah,
and that seems to be so much advice that the people that have come before us that have succeeded in the areas that we want to play and mess with, that's the same advice they give us. And it is so important to select people, the people that you're going to be around, that are going to impact your mind, that are going to help and assist you. What, have you done that intentionally in your life?
Somewhat, I guess. I mean, I did a lot of teaching myself, and I have mentored writers wherever I have been, and so I certainly appreciate that process. I had a couple of really excellent professors in college who really helped me understand where my writing skills were. For a while, I thought about creative writing, doing novels and short stories. That was not my bent. I'm more of a I don't know, I guess I would call it kind of a straight ahead journalist kind of writer. The criticism that I've done of theater and other arts has been interesting for me because I had to develop more interpretive skills. And I guess on that, I would say that I've developed that with comparing myself with colleagues that I've had through the American Theater Critics Association, which I've been a member of for about 25 years now. In fact, I chaired it in the middle 2000s for a couple of years. And I got to go to other cities and see theater there, which gave me a great frame of reference for evaluating theater locally. But I also got to meet people who were themselves already well established as writers about the medium of theater, and I could really model my writing, maybe not model, but be inspired by the writing of them and see how they covered things. How did they cover something that maybe wasn't a perfect production? How do you do that without just being mean and nasty about things? And how do you be encouraging about things? And how do you write things that aren't just trying to tell a director how he or she should have directed a show, which is not really what the job should be. You might be able to talk about why something didn't seem to work to you, but my bottom line with writing theater criticism was always to say to people, go to the theater. Here's my thoughts on this, but, you don't have to take my word for it. I'll try to describe it in ways that you'll get some sense of what it might be. But, go and judge for yourself. And if you read me often enough and you like the way I report on things, well, then maybe you should take my recommendations. But if I'm less than enthusiastic about something, it doesn't mean you shouldn't go to see it.
Is that the right way to say something sucks? I'm less than enthusiastic.
It could be. It could be.
Yeah, that's what
I only say that when I walk out of the theater. Then I go home and I write it nicer.
I was wondering, but you articulated it well. It's like, hey, what makes a good critic of a movie? Because now if you pull up an app, a Fandango app, for example, and you have the popcorn and then the tomatoes, and one is from the critics, the so-called professional critics,
right,
and the others are from just the average person watching it. And there are times that they are completely divergent. How do we explain that?
Well, I think that the audience, the tomatoes. Was that the tomatoes?
Yes, I think so.
They are.
I don't know though. Maybe they're the popcorn.
Yeah, I think they're the popcorn.
Yeah, correct.
And because they sit there and munch their popcorn, and it's an entertainment experience for them. Critics tend to evaluate things in the context of all that they've seen. How does this measure up? Now, I always try to say to people when I'm tutoring them about being critics is, first and foremost, you've got to react to what's in front of you. Don't just say, oh, I saw this show on Broadway and it wasn't like this, it was a whole lot better. Well, that's not fair. Look at the production. What were they trying to do, and evaluate that. And I've, over the course of my career, I've seen hundreds. I've probably seen thousands of theater productions. And so I've got a frame of reference in which I can really make those kind of evaluations of things. But I really try to put stuff in, and I try to, I guess I'm sort of the glass is half full rather than half empty kind of reviewer. I always try to find something. I always say, nobody ever set out to do a bad job with a theater production. They really want it to be something that people will see and respond to. That may not always work, but there are probably things that work. An actor who does a great performance, or a musical number that's just like, wow, that was incredible. Those kinds of things I'd always try to pick out so that people know that there is some of that on stage, regardless of the overall quality of the production.
I found I'm not anywhere near the capable critic, but I was in New York City about a month and a half ago, and I said, hey, is there a last-minute ticket? And I went and saw Lion King. And had about a 10th row seat, but all the way at the edge, so I wasn't able to see the full stage. It was impressive. It's the first time I've ever been to Broadway in New York City.
Oh, okay.
And but it was neat. But I walked away. There was one moment that really was significant, almost like what people are talking about recently at the Super Bowl, the Chris Stapleton national anthem. They're almost putting it up there with Whitney Houston's in the past. And is it that even in maybe a theatrical performance that struggles, let's say that, does it just need a moment or two? Because I walked away and there was an actress who had one of the most amazing solos. I don't even know the name of the song, but I was in awe for 2.5 minutes. And that's how I remember the Lion King.
Well, that's certainly, it's moments like that that are going to make a show memorable. If that's the only thing that happens, it might not be enough. But, a show like Wicked, which is going to be a movie before too long. Somebody's working on that. But there is a song on that called Defying Gravity. And it's when Elphaba, who is the green girl, decides that she's going to stop being concerned about what other people think of her, and it's going to allow her to fly. She's going to be able to defy gravity. And that song is one of those kind of things. It's one of those moments that distills a production. I will tell you that I've seen Lion King a number of times, including a junior high school production in which my grandson played Mufasa, and he was the smallest kid on stage.
How'd that work?
I thought that didn't quite make sense. Nevertheless, seeing professional productions of it, and I would imagine that they are still staging it this way, the procession of the animals at the very front end of the show, when they come down the aisles and up onto the stage, and they are really all puppets or actors wearing pieces that turn them into the animals. That just knocked me out the first time I saw it, and every time I see it, the hair on the back of my neck just stands up. It's like, I can't believe this is so wonderful. And it's one of those magical theatrical moments that, to me, is you can see the people doing it, but you can also see the vision that they are creating, and that's a lasting moment for me.
It's a way to kick off a performance. Wow.
Yeah.
Or another one of those moments, Memories in Cats.
Yes, and that's that song, which it's interesting. That show is based on poetry by T.S. Eliot, who wrote this sort of it was sort of a throwaway. I think it was a bunch of poems about different kind of cats. Most of his poetry is much deeper, more philosophical, harder to digest. But this was sort of a fun thing. When Andrew Lloyd Webber created Cats, he used most of the songs are based on those poems. Memory is not. It's one that he just wrote. He wrote for that cat who was going to get to go up to heaven and that sort of thing. And so it was not one based in the poetry, but it's that kind of number that everybody remembers. So, yeah.
The moment.
Yeah.
In the book, The 100 Things to Do Before We Die, I'm going to change the title of this before we're done today. I'm going to call it 99 Things.
Okay.
So I don't have to do the 109. What of the 100 things are theatrical, arts-based? What are one or two of the moments or places that feel significant to you? Are there one or two of the 100 that are arts that are are impactful?
I've already I've touched on like going to see theater at the Playhouse, and I also mentioned going to CCM to see these 18 to 22-year-olds who are already Broadway caliber talent in training. They graduate and they go straight on to New York and end up, they might be in the chorus of a show or two, and then they're getting roles, while they're still in their mid-20s. So going to CCM for that kind of opportunity. In the new book, I do talk about, in the third edition that's coming out, I talk more also about Cincinnati Shakespeare. It is a rare opportunity to have a classical theater. There are much larger cities that do not have classical theaters that really focus on Shakespeare's works, but other great works of British and American literature. And to be able to go there and see a company of actors who now live here in town take on roles, sometimes comic, sometimes serious, and they bring in guest actors and that sort of thing. But, that theater company has been here for almost 30 years. And in that time, they have produced every play that Shakespeare produced, that he wrote, 38 plays. They've done all of them. There are only, I believe, 5 theaters in the United States that have accomplished that. It's called the canon. And there's only 5 that have done all 38 of the canon. That's, we're not the 5th largest city in the country.
Yeah, like 30-something.
Yeah. So it's that. So that is definitely in the book. And they've also, the other noteworthy thing about Cincinnati Shakespeare is that they have they were an itinerant group for a long time. They were in a church basement for a while. They were in a little black box theater at the Aronoff Center for a while, and then they were in that old movie theater on Ray Street. Mm-hmm. But then as of about 6 years ago, they built a new theater on Elm Street in Over the Rhine. It is a fabulous physical facility. None of the seats are more than 20 feet from the stage, so you're really close to what's going on there. And I've seen some wonderful, wonderful productions there.
What Stephen Sondheim? What made him so special?
Oh gosh, I wrote this encyclopedia about him, which is 650 pages. So ask me to distill that. I like to say, I think one of the things that makes him special is the fact, as I've mentioned, that he wrote both music and lyrics for things. Most musicals that you go to see, there is a composer and a lyricist, 2 separate people. Rodgers and Hammersteiner, Kander and Ebb, Ahrens and Flaherty. They are, and there are lots of them. They're very talented, and they're people who've worked together really successfully. But Sondheim did both, and that sets him apart. Now there are a few other people that have done that, but he did so in a remarkable way, and he did 18 musicals. And I always say, if you've seen one Sondheim show, you've only seen one Sondheim show. No Sondheim show is like another Sondheim show. There are silly shows like Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, or Into the Woods. Into the Woods isn't silly, but it's based on fairy tales and that sort of thing. And then you've got Sweeney Todd, which is about a serial killer, and you've got Assassins, which is about people who assassinated or tried to assassinate American presidents. I mean, he just was always looking for a new challenge. He wrote a song once called "I Never Do Anything Twice," and that could be carved on his tombstone, because all these shows that he did. But the other thing that he did that I think is rather different, typically with musical theater teams is that they write the music and then they work with a book writer, somebody who writes the script for the show, and they find places to hang the music on the story. Sondheim worked very closely with book writers on every one of his shows, but he developed the music as the story was being written, and he really placed the music in where something might be more effectively conveyed through music than through spoken word. And then he would write something, and he would also, in many cases, spend time, once they had the show cast and they were beginning to rehearse, he would get to know the performer who was going to be singing that song and write something that was appropriate for his or her voice. And I would use the example of Ethel Merman playing the role of the crazy stage mother in Gypsy. She was already well known. I mean, she had a voice like a trombone, and was people would come just hear her sing. Well, Sondheim used that powerful voice for the character of Rose in that show. He wrote the very funny character of Mrs. Lovett in Sweeney Todd. She's the one who bakes the meat pies that use the results of Sweeney's throat slitting, and Angela Lansbury played that role, and he wrote music for her that was perfect. And the other example that I like to use, because most people know the song called "Send in the Clowns," which is from the show called A Little Night Music. He wrote it for an actress who had a very silvery, kind of breathy voice. She couldn't sustain long lines of singing. And so he wrote that, and if you listen to that, it's all real short things. Isn't it rich, is the first line of it. It's just a couple of words, and it stops. It doesn't have a long, drawn-out vowel sound in it. And he was so meticulous in everything that he wrote, but he was really taking those kinds of things into consideration. So those are some of the things that make him, I think, really unique in the world of musical theater.
So as I'm sitting here listening to that, it's like this guy was a master.
He was a genius in my book. I've interviewed lots of people in my career of writing and interviewing, but he far and away is the person who, in my mind, most closely I would define as a genius, the way he could put the stuff together like that.
So what does define a genius? If we went down this path of, hey, let's articulate how we can define someone who's a genius, what is that?
Well, I think they excel above average or even way above average human achievement in being able to do something, be it being a math genius, or a physics genius like Albert Einstein.
Or Tesla or something in electricity.
Right, people like that. They are people who think outside the box, who do things. I mean, I'll tell you another Sondheim story here. He got, I'm going to say, sort of roped into doing a show called Pacific Overtures, which is a musical about when Admiral Perry sailed into Japan in the middle of the 19th century and kind of opened it up. It had been a very closed society. And a young playwright had written a play about it, and Hal Prince, who was going to direct it, said, this doesn't work as a play. I think it needs to be a musical. And that sounded even weirder to some people. And he went to Sondheim and said, I think that you should do the music for this. And he said, I don't know anything about Asian music. How can I do that? Well, he dug in and he ended up writing music that has Asian tonalities to it. Now, if Hal Prince had gone to 20 other composers, they would have just said, oh, you're crazy. I don't know how to do that. Sondheim dug in and figured out how to do that sort of thing. So I think that's a piece of what defines genius, is that they think outside the box and do it consistently. They have a strong foundation in what they are doing, but they go so far above and beyond what other peoples have been able to achieve that qualifies them for that nomenclature.
I wonder if there's something inside of there. I don't know if Elon Musk is our current genius. He definitely thinks different, right?
And he definitely thinks he is a genius.
He does, doesn't he? I don't know if that's an issue or not. But going back to, like Michelangelo.
Yeah.
is that genius level in the 1500s or whatever?
I think so. That magnificent art and images and and we see sketches of, he was devising flying machines before anybody knew anything about aerodynamics and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think he definitely would be one that would qualify.
Do you think a genius can be created? Do you think they start different, or is it a different wavelength their brain's thinking at, or maybe they just do it longer and more, and they're obsessed? And
well, I think there is a certain element of tenacity that is important to succeed with your God-given gifts. But I don't know. I think that, people go to Harvard and Yale and so on and think that, that's going to accelerate their ability to be successful, if not to become a genius. And some of them do. But, I think a lot of relatively average people, they work hard and do well as a result of that kind of training. But I think there has to be something in the spirit of an individual who is motivated to go above and beyond. And that really makes a difference. And so many geniuses are sort of what we call polymaths, people who have many dimensions, and they put things together in ways that the rest of us don't connect those dots successfully.
That maybe seems so simple to them.
Yes.
And fascinating to the rest of us.
Yeah. I will say something about Sondheim. Although he intimidated a lot of people because he was so smart, he was never mean and didn't hold up the fact that he was a genius. And in fact, he when a show was ready to start up, he would devise funny little gifts that he would give to people, and everybody loved working with him. And it may be that many of them, he would correct them. You're singing that as a B and it's really a B sharp or whatever. But he was always right, and he didn't do it to embarrass them
in a condescending way.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No.
There's a good 60 Minutes interview out there of him if people go to YouTube. It's good, and he seems just like an average simple guy. Mm-hmm. Right? But then there's so much depth there.
Yeah.
So this you have here Oldest Cincinnati as well.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about maybe the difference.
Well, let me first tell you that was my COVID project.
Okay.
In 2020, locked down at home. Mm-hmm. Because I enjoy Cincinnati history. I had quite a few books, and of course we've got Wikipedia and the internet and that sort of thing. And I said, I'm just going to start looking for old stuff around town and writing up little pieces about them. And that's what this book became. It's a compendium of about 90 things that are the oldest in one way or another that can still be visited. That makes it a little bit like my 100 Things book. Everything in that book you can go and see. And the oldest book is the same with that. Sometimes it's very simple and very ancient things. I talk about the buffalo roads in northern Kentucky, which were the paths that migratory buffalo beat down that became highways, like Dixie Highway, not too far from where we're sitting right now.
Right out front of the
building.
That's
where if you'd been here 10,000 years ago, you would have seen the buffalo.
Maybe been run over.
I always say that they were our first traffic engineers because they developed those highways. So, I found out some things like that. But we've got a lot of old stuff around here. And so it was really fun to be putting that together. And some of the stuff I already knew, but more of it I really had to dig in and learn more. And so it was great fun doing that.
Is the Behringer Crawford Museum in northern Kentucky, is that our most significant museum south of Cincinnati here in northern Kentucky?
I think so.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting museum. I love that place. It's kind of funky. It's got that two-headed calf and some oddball things like that. But, it's got the train displays, and it's just sort of, there's always something interesting there. It's a great place to visit. And
why do you think that we have we were impacted by German culture? Mm-hmm. We were impacted by Greek culture, obviously, through this chili thing.
Yeah.
Right? Why do you think Cincinnati isn't segmented into some of those parts of the towns? Like you have Little Italy if you go to big cities, and then you'll have Chinatown in certain places. Were we not big enough for that?
Maybe that's the case. I think, the Germans were they were everywhere.
Okay.
And over the Rhine was a heavily German neighborhood, and the west side of town, there was more German population there, and that's still the real multi-generational families that you find here tend to be people who are West Siders. So there was some of that. We do have a few, and there is a sort of an enclave of Italians in Newport. Mm-hmm. And there is an Italian festival every year, but they're not very many.
Yeah.
And so I think that it really, and if we were a bigger city, I'm from Cleveland originally. Cleveland has a little Italy, but it has there were a lot of Eastern European immigrants that came there. So there's a Croatian neighborhood and a Czech neighborhood and all of those kinds of things that are pretty distinct from one another. And we just didn't seem to have so much of that. After the Germans came here, let's think about that for a second. The Germans really, their big immigration was in the
1800s?
middle of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And what happened after that was that trains started running, and they carried people farther west. People could still use the river, but you went a lot faster on a train. And so the train routes sort of bypassed Cincinnati and went to Chicago. Mm-hmm. And look at Chicago. It became a big, giant city. And I think it was because of a lot of those kinds of things. A lot of immigrants came and traveled there. So that might be part of it, too.
Whatever happened to our subway that was supposed to be?
A couple of things. So, if people just need a little bit of background, there was a canal that ran from Toledo to the Ohio River, the Miami and Erie Canal it was called. And that path came down the sort of western edge of the state, all the way down through Dayton, down here, came into the city at Lockland. That's why Lockland is called Lockland, because there was a lock there. And then it came down, and it came basically to what we call Central Parkway today. Came down and made that curve there at the sort of the bottom edge of Over the Rhine, and went over to Eggleston Avenue and then dumped into the Ohio River. So there was that canal. In fact, that canal is why we call that neighborhood Over the Rhine. There were little bridges across it that people walked across, mostly German immigrants. That was pretty much a German-speaking neighborhood. And so they sort of jokingly called it Over the Rhine. The canal was in no way, shape, or form did it really resemble the Rhine River, but it was sort of funny, and the name stuck. So that was there. In the early 20th century, that was all gone. Dried up. It was just this sort of disgusting ditch for a while, and they said, all right, let's turn this into a boulevard, and they made Central Parkway. Then in the late teens, they got this idea because New York had a subway and a couple other cities did that. Well, why don't we do something like that? So they said, well, let's use that path that's already there. We can follow that. So they dug it up. There's about 2.5 miles of what they dug. But what happened then? World War I, the economy really changed, and people started driving cars. And who wanted public transportation when they had their own car? So they never really finished it. I mean, there are still, under parts of Central Parkway, there are still platforms and cement that they poured. They never laid any track in it, but if you can ever get down in there, it's kind of a not very pleasant place. The water main that runs through some of it, and people have gone down in there and done a lot of graffiti and that sort of thing. But it's sort of like a ghost town, because you can kind of see, there's steps. You can see where people would have gone up and down from the platforms and gotten on the cars. So it's still there, but by about the mid-20s, the cost of doing it had escalated, and the Depression was knocking at the door. And finally, they just said, this isn't going to work, and they closed it up and paved it over and put Central Parkway back in again. So
who knows what could have been?
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
It could have grown different parts of our cities in ways that it didn't.
Sort of like how the streetcar might today.
Right.
If we were, when that streetcar was first being considered, there was talk that it would go up to the University of Cincinnati area and the hospitals, and it would really connect to employment centers. That didn't happen for a variety of reasons, political and personal, I guess. But now there's talk about developing and extending routes, maybe one to northern Kentucky even. So, those can make such a tremendous difference by moving people more effectively. Even today, even with the sort of small route that the streetcar uses now, the amount of economic development along those routes is phenomenal. It's really made a difference. It's made Over the Rhine into much more of the kind of place that a lot of people had for a long time envisioned that it could become. And it's crept all the way up to Findlay Market and the brewery areas up there now.
Jumping back to the sports thing a little bit, you wrote a book about the Bengals.
I did.
Right? What was the name of that?
It's called The Cincinnati Bengals, an Illustrated Timeline, and I co-authored that with a fellow named Jeff Cease, who writes about history for the Cincinnati Enquirer.
Okay. Why are we sports fans?
I think it goes back to something that you asked me about early on here about pride in a city. And we all want to brag about our teams, be it UC or Xavier basketball or our pro teams, or even some of our high school teams. I mean, for a long time, Moeller High School was like a national power. And people are proud of that sort of thing and can say, I'm, as if they played on those teams, somehow. But, they go to see the games. They're big fans. They wear the sweatshirts or the hats, or they paint their faces with tiger stripes, whatever. And, it gets all tied up in pride of the city. So I think that, and I mean, you go to any city, you've got the cheeseheads in Wisconsin, and, you've got people everywhere who are, finding ways to do that. I think it's all tied up in civic pride.
Is that a good thing?
I don't know that it's a bad thing. I think that sometimes it gets a little extreme, and it's why the Cleveland Indians became the Cleveland Guardians, and because a lot of those things people looked at and decided maybe that there were things about that was sort of derogatory. I see the Kansas City Chiefs still use the tomahawk chop, which some people find is a little degrading.
The Atlanta Braves, same thing.
Yeah. So yeah. But I think that all in all, I think it really, at least when a team does well, it is really a positive sense of pride in the city.
Feels like it's our team. We don't own them. They're not paying us.
That's right.
We pay exorbitant fees to go see them.
That's right.
Right? It's fascinating to me.
And taxes for the stadiums that they play in and all that.
It's wild.
They are sort of ours,
Yeah, right. One way or another. Do you have a hero? I know Stephen Sondheim's pretty impactful in your life, but do you have a hero?
A hero? I guess it probably would be Sondheim. I have some literary figures who I really think highly of. Here's a hero that I can't imagine anybody else would say this. My doctoral dissertation was about a guy in the 15th century who wrote the Arthurian legend materials, King Arthur and the Round Table, translated it from French into English. It was published in 1485 by Thomas Caxton, who was the first English publisher. Not too long after Gutenberg and his press in Germany, Caxton was in London. Very first thing he published was Le Morte d'Arthur, the King Arthur stories, and that was what this Sir Thomas Malory translated. Now, he's not my hero, but in the 1930s, a British scholar named Eugene Vinaver found a manuscript that predated Caxton's publishing and compared it to what Caxton published. And it turned out Caxton did quite a bit of editing of what Malory had written. And so Vinaver sort of put this all together and published a 3-volume edition of this with an incredible amount of annotation. That came out in late 1940s. Took him 17 years to compare the manuscript and this sort of thing. In the late 1960s, he came out with a second edition. He went back and did it all again, and even more thoroughly. So in the early late 70s, I went to an academic conference. This guy, by that time, he was elderly. And I was at a medieval studies conference in, where was that? It was in Michigan, at a university in Michigan. Anyway, I was there, and I went in and sat down to listen to some erudite scholar read a paper that he had written. And there was this elderly man sitting next to me with really thick glasses on, and he leaned over and said, could you tell me, is this, what is this? I can't read this. My vision isn't very good. And so I told him whatever the name of the session was. And then when it was over, several people came over to him and said, "Oh, Professor Vanaver, it's so nice to see you here." And I about wet my pants. I realized I was sitting next to this guy that without him, I would not have had material to write my doctoral dissertation about. And the fact that he did all that work, so diligent, so insightful. I don't know that he was a genius, but he was totally committed to creating something that would be meaningful and important in the study of the English language and literature. So I'd say he was a hero.
I didn't know that the King Arthur story was French.
Originally, if you go back and look at it, I mean, some of the stories are from British myths and legends, but the Lancelot, his name was Lancelot du Lac, Lancelot of the Lake, and a lot of those stories come from there. There was an immense amount of material written in what was called Middle French. We talk about Middle English, so this was French, the French language in the 13th, 14th century. And what Mallory did was condense a bunch of that and used stories from it. I mean, that French version is like 15 volumes, and what Mallory created is like 3. Mm-hmm. So what he distilled is what today we sort of think of as the legend of King Arthur. There are a whole lot of other stories that he kind of left out, and scholars study all those other things. There's other knights and kings and things that are stories about, but he really distilled it down to, if you've ever seen the musical Camelot, mm-hmm. It's the story of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere and Lancelot having an affair with Queen Guinevere and creating all kinds of disturbances in England. None of that's real. It's all made-up stories.
I was going to say, is it all fiction?
It is.
You don't think maybe over the centuries that there's pieces that came from nonfiction?
Well, the common wisdom on that is that there was some kind of a guy, he was more like a tribal chieftain in about the 8th century, who did some things that unified some of the tribes and kingdoms in what was then Britain, and that he was sort of the model and inspiration for that. A character named Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote some of this down, and some of those stories sound sort of like some of the King Arthur legends. So there may be in the dim and distant past some, but it was really Mallory's Morte d'Arthur that really created what we think of as the Arthurian legend.
Is that work for the professor, I forget you said his name, that you sat next to?
Vanaver, yes.
So are there still a decent amount of people like that in the world that are still doing this work?
I'm going to say I think so, but that I stepped away from that world about 10 years after I got that PhD. I didn't ever teach at a university, and instead I went into doing PR and journalism and that sort of thing. So I'm not so aware of them. All of the scholarship that I did around that all dates from the late 60s and early 70s when I was working on that sort of thing. I'm sure there are people who are still doing that at British universities and American universities, but I don't know so much about them anymore.
Have you been to Paris?
Yes.
I was just there, my first time too. What a significant city.
Oh, it's a beautiful place.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was a layover coming back from Spain and Morocco. One night we went out and saw the city and walked mm-hmm. around and had onion soup, not French onion soup. I had to get that right.
Yes.
But wow, what a cool city.
Yeah.
Man.
My wife and I went there oh gosh, now it's about 20 years ago, I think. And we spent most of our time going to art museums. Fabulous. The Louvre is there, but there are other wonderful museums. I mean, and we had a wonderful tour book that was walking tours that you could do of Paris. And it had about, I don't know, maybe a dozen tours, and they were all rooted in the metro, the subway there. So, go to this stop and get off there, and then walk this loop and go around, and you'll come back to that stop again. And then you can go back to where you were, or you can go and do another one. It made it so easy to get around. It goes back to what we were talking about, public transportation, and how it can help a city to develop and flourish. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Napoleon, his sarcophagus is still there.
Yeah.
Right? That's wild.
Yeah.
What a cool city. Which one or two of your favorite places in this country to go to spend time in? We know we love our city.
Yeah.
But
well, I love to go to New York City because theater. I mean, I go and there's so much theater, and it's not just Broadway. There's off Broadway and what they call off Broadway, which is more like the Fringe Festival that we have here in town. Very experimental stuff. I could go there for a month and see something, just about every day. So that would be one. I love to go to Chicago, a great city for food. It's also a great city for theater, and my son and my grandkids live there, so that's another important reason. Those would be the two places that I guess I would most readily say. I also spent some time, again, because of theater, this Theater Critics Association that I was part of annually had a conference in some city where there was a goodly amount of theater, and we would be there for a week or so and get to see a lot of theater. And I would say that San Francisco was a wonderful city for that. The other city that I was really impressed with the theater and with other things was the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
What? Let's say someone wants to begin participating in the theater scene. Where do they go? If someone, back from when I was a kid and when I was in high school and in college, I dabbled a little bit. If they want to go get involved, where do they go? Where's the best place to?
Now, do you mean involved by actually being part of it, or just going to see it?
Be a part of it. How do you become part of the scene?
Well, one way is through community theater. I mean, we have about 20, 25 great community theaters in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, which is just a bunch of people. It's basically volunteers who love theater, and they come together to put on shows. And their audience tends to be families of people who are, they get all their friends to come, or their kids and, grandparents or whatever. So I think that's one way, and a lot of them do very credible work. I don't review much of that sort of thing, in part because they're amateurs, and also because there's so many of them. If I interviewed one, then I'd have 19 more knocking on my door, and I already have a hard time seeing all the theater that's available out there. But that's a great way to sort of get involved, and you will find if you go in sort of as someone who's not very experienced, there'll be people there who majored in theater in college, or who are, they're artistic and they like to design sets. And, you can get involved in any of those kinds of ways. I mean, I got involved with theater because of a high school teacher. When I was a freshman in high school, I was sitting in a study hall, probably, screwing around. And this teacher came in and said, "All you boys in the front row, get up and come down the hall. We're having auditions for a production of Our Town, and I need some more boys." So I went down and I got cast in a small part. I was in like 2 scenes in it. I played a milkman named Howie Newsom, and I had a ball doing it. And so from that point on, I was in every theater production, one way or another. Maybe I don't sing, so if I had a part in a musical, it was not a very big part, or it was a non-singing part. And so, but through high school, I was in 8 different shows. And so that set me up to be interested in theater. I knew the only reason I think I really got parts in shows in high school was I was a boy who was willing to go on stage. I wasn't all that talented, but I loved going to theater and developed a lot of insight and opinion, and I did go on and get, graduate degrees in literature. So, I could be evaluative of works of theater and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Isn't that fascinating? One moment, a teacher walks in.
And here's a story on that one. Her name was Mary Price, and she directed all the theater I was in all through high school. She just passed away this past year, and she was 110 years old. So when I had her as a teacher, she was in her 50s already, and she lived to be 110. Amazing.
What is it about you and these 100-year-old plus women?
Well, I don't know, but my mother just had her 102nd birthday, so I guess I gravitate to them. Something
about some genes and the people you hang out with, huh?
Maybe. My mother says, don't try to live this long.
Yeah.
She said, it's sure people fuss over you, she said, but it's not all that fun. My dad passed away a long time ago, and most of the people who were her dear friends are not around anymore. It's just me and my sisters are the ones that she can still count on. So
she must be. I bet your mom's special to you.
She is, very much so.
Why is that?
Well, I guess it's because she and my dad both supported me and my sisters in doing things we wanted to do. My parents didn't have very much interest in theater, but they knew that I'd fallen into it and loved it. And they both said, well, if that's what he likes, then let's support him. They were both college-educated people. My mother enjoyed theater more than my dad. My dad, he would come and see a show if I was involved in it, but not much more beyond that. He was much more into music. He could pick up. He was never trained as a musician, but he could pick up musical instruments and play them. They were wonderful parents. They encouraged. My sisters are both younger than I. They encouraged all of us to just live life and do things that we were good at doing and try to be the best that we could be.
It's simple.
Yeah.
And we try to make it so complicated.
Yeah.
They were both college educated. That's unique for them.
Yeah,
they were born.
They would have. My mother graduated from the University of Akron in 1941 and with a degree in Latin, of all things, but she became a code girl. Went to Washington, D.C. during the war and helped with decoding, military transmissions and that sort of thing.
She had a CIA mom your whole life and you didn't even know
it. It was not that. What did they call that? The Army Signal Corps was what she was part of. And they were dealing with Japanese stuff, not Japanese language. It was like code stuff, and it was numbers. And she was good with numbers and seeing patterns in numbers. And that's. They had her she said, when I tested to do this, they gave us crossword puzzles and, she liked to do Sudokus and things like that. So she never taught. She had that degree in Latin. She said she student taught and said, I was wrong. This is not for me. Maybe it was because she was trying to teach Latin. But and my dad did not quite finish college, but because his college was interrupted by the war, but he would have gotten a degree in electrical engineering, and he was a jack of all trades. He could repair things and build things, and he loved to garden, and he was a great guy, and he was always helping neighbors with stuff that they needed. So they were both people that were very engaged in the community where we lived, and I guess that's another lesson that I learned from them.
Is it how important is it our childhood and forming who you've become?
I wouldn't be who I am. Here, give me that.
Yes, this one.
Give me that book. I want to read you my dedication for this book. I wrote to my parents, Frank and Merle Pender. He was a Renaissance handyman, able and willing to do many things, not unlike the pioneers who built Cincinnati. She had a curiosity about the world that lit a fire in me to always be reading and learning more. Their model of hard work and generous spirits, as well as my happy boyhood home, were the perfect foundation for my own pursuits. That made my mom cry when I read it to her.
Because I think they probably just did what they thought they were supposed to do.
That's right.
Didn't seem anything significant to them.
So I'll tell you, this is a quick story.
Yeah.
About 5 years ago, my mom said, I'm getting up there, and the next time everybody comes together, it's probably going to be for my funeral. And she said, no, I'm going to miss that. So she said, would you and your sisters set up some kind of get-together now? I think she was 98 at the time. And we said, sure. So we did. So we grew up in this little community out in the country east of Cleveland. We lived near a lake called Bass Lake. And most of the families that were there when we were growing up were the baby boomer kids, and our parents were all, people who were born during the Depression and that sort of thing. At that get-together, in addition to all my cousins and things like that who all showed up, there were about 10 people that we refer to as Bass Lake kids. I'm doing air quotes here, who were now all in their 60s and 70s, who came because they remembered my mom. And she had been somebody that they all loved. If we were, hanging or playing around in the yard there and it was dinner time, she'd just have everybody come in and have dinner. And they were that kind of people. Very, very involved.
Special.
Yeah.
So where do we start? Tomorrow when we wake up on, what will that be, the 22nd of March, where do we start?
Well, what I would say to you, since you are a Cincinnati native,
Northern Kentucky, but
Northern
yes,
Kentucky,
same thing,
is that you probably would want to, on that first day, look through it and say, all right, I've already done some of these things, so maybe you check those off. I mean, you don't have to go and eat Skyline chili or Grater's ice cream. So I have a lot of things that in the book that I call, well, of course, you're going to do them, and but then I'd suggest to people, then start looking for stuff that you haven't done. And about half the material I tried to create was something that even people who've lived here all their lives would say, oh, I heard about that, but I've never done it. I've never driven out to Peebles, Ohio to see the Serpent Mound, or I've never driven down toward Lexington to go to the Kentucky Horse Park. Any of those kinds of things. So, you can find those kind of things. And, maybe you start off with a few things, maybe you knock off 2 or 3 that are local and familiar to you, but then, go on and find more.
So we need the book to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So where do we go to find the book? It
is at almost all the local bookstores. Joseph Beth, of course, the Roebling bookstores over here in Northern Kentucky. And it's also available online. The publisher is called Reedy Press, Reedy, and it's reedypress.com. And frankly, if you're interested in going to other cities and you'd like to find similar books, you can find the 138 or however many there are all on their website. And my oldest Cincinnati book is also published by them.
What a cool way. We talked about the tour book that you had when you went to Paris.
Yeah.
This could be our tour book for the cities in the U.S.
So last summer, my wife and I took a trip to Bentonville, Arkansas, to an art museum there called Crystal Bridges. It was the Walton family.
Yeah, it was just one where Walmart
put the money into it. Yeah. It's an incredible museum. But to get there and to get back, we drove through St. Louis, and that's where this publisher is located. And so we stopped, and I got to meet the people who I've been dealing with email and phone calls and that sort of thing. That was fun. But while I was there, I grabbed a copy of 100 Things to Do in St. Louis Before You Die, because we spent 2 or 3 days there. And we went to a market, I'm going to forget what it's called now, but it was sort of like a big Findlay market sort of place. And, so it's great fun. So it's a great book, a great series of books. And that is the kind of thing. They've done a number of other titles that are sort of templates, some of which are available here in Cincinnati by other authors. There's one called Secret Cincinnati, sort of out-of-the-way places. And there's one called Treasure Hunt Cincinnati. And, it's sort of you can go through and kind of check things off. So it's a really kind of unique niche for a publisher to have.
So many people talk about writing books these days. What was that process like? Writing, you've written many books.
Yeah.
What's that like?
Well, my first toe in the water was the 100 Things book, and it was so similar to the writing that I did when I was the arts and entertainment editor at CityBeat. Every week I would write one or two or three what we called to-do picks of things to do. 100, 150 words, festival, concert, something like that. The entries in this book are all things about that length. So my brain was already focused on doing that kind of writing. I had to do, 100 of them, and they set the categories for you. There's 5 chapters in the book, and I've mentioned arts and entertainment and food and drink, and so I had to pick up things that fit into those categories, but they were pretty broad, and I was able, there's culture and history, so I could get all my theater references in and that sort of thing. So that one wasn't too hard to do. Oldest Cincinnati, because I'd learned about for the 100 Things book, I'd learned some about historical stuff, and I've lived in a couple of different historical neighborhoods here in town. In addition to over the Rhine, where I lived for about 10 years, I lived up in the Prospect Hill neighborhood in Mount Auburn, just north of downtown. I lived over here in northern Kentucky for a while in Latonia. So I have some interest in local history already, and so it was sort of fun to start, okay, now let's find these things. And I talk a lot about the river playing such a central role in why the city is here. And so it was sort of fun. I talk about the bridges and about flatboats coming down the river and all of those kinds of things. So again, those pieces are longer than the ones in the 100 Things book, but not a lot longer. It's in most cases it's a page or two, maybe 3, not more than that, about the various items that are in that book. When I did a book about Sondheim, that was kind of different because I had edited a magazine about him for about a dozen years, and I had a lot of, which I edited and wrote some for, but I had a lot of material by other writers, so I could look things up and had that sort of readily at hand. But my contract with the publisher for that book was for 300,000 words. That's about 4 or 5 novels. And so I just started cranking away. It's like an A to Z. It's really only A to Y. I couldn't come up with a Z for it, but an A to Y compendium of things. And I just would write stuff. I wrote about each one of the musicals in depth, but then I wrote about significant performers like Ethel Merman, who was in a show, and wrote a sort of a biographical entry about her. So, anybody could pick this up. It's all in alphabetical order, go through and I find that what a lot of people do is they might read an entry about, let's say, Gypsy, and they read about, Julie Stein, who was the composer. Well, then they can go read an entry about Julie Stein. And then, they could read an entry about Ethel Merman. So it's got all that kind of stuff. So maybe it might take me a day or two to write one of those entries. Some of them were 1,000 or 2,000 words. And it took me about 2 years. And I treated it I was retired from having a day job by that time. So I pretty much treated that as my day job for about 2 years. I'd sit down at 9 or 10 in the morning and take a break for lunch and work through the afternoon, sometimes into the evening. And in about 2 years' time, I got that all cranked out.
Just sit down and write.
Yeah. That's really the trick. And now, I think that for me, writing a novel or something that was a big, long topic would be a little more of a challenge because you really got to think big picture about something like that. With this, it was like I could chip away at. I had a calendar with the Sondheim book that I was like every week I'd write down how many words I'd written that week, and I would go like a running total. It was like fundraising where the thermometer keeps going up, and I kept getting closer to 300,000.
Did you see yourself as an author before you wrote these?
No. I think I thought of myself more as a journalist, which means you're writing shorter things. Mm-hmm. And I've always been a good writer, but I have one other book that shows up if you look me up as an author, which I still chuckle about. So when we had the Big Pig gig here in town, all those ceramic
around
pigs
town
all over the city, they published a book about it, which they called Pigs in the City, I think.
What a great name.
And they asked me to help out with it, which meant writing photo captions, and then I did a little afterword, and it was about why I got involved in this and how I moved to Cincinnati and came to love the city and that sort of thing. But that was all that there was no other text in the book. I was writing a sentence about, a couple of, funny pigs that were, based on the arts or something like that. And I wrote this. Well, I got credited as the author of that book.
There you go.
I went out and did signings they didn't have anybody else to do it. So I was friends with the people at Artworks who sponsored that whole program. And they said, well, we got these bookstores, we've got this book, and they want people to come out and do it. So sometimes I would gather up one or two of the artists who had done one of the pigs, who could talk about that process, and then I would talk a little bit about the book. So people did call me an author on that one. So, but then there's the Bengals book. Mm-hmm. So let me tell you a quick story on that. So that's another one by Reedy Press. So they called me up during the Bengals playoffs there in 22. It would have been probably late February. They weren't at the Super Bowl yet, but they were marching through the playoffs. And the publisher there said, we've done a couple of books about sports franchises, and sounds like the Bengals might be a good one to take on. Would you be in a position to do that? And I said, I'm a sports fan. I'm not really a sports writer, but let me think about it. And they said, well, and if you don't think you can do it, then point us to a sports writer. Well, I referred them to a couple of people who were all busy writing about the Super Bowl and didn't really and I said, when do you need the text for this? They said, well, we'd like to have it by April the 1st. That gave me about 5 weeks to pull it together. And I said, I'm a pretty fast writer, but I'm not sure that I can do that. They said, well, how about if we put you together with Jeff Cease, another writer who's done things with them, who's done a lot of books about Cincinnati history. And I said, I know Jeff. He helped me with photos for the oldest Cincinnati book because he had access to all the Enquirer's photo archives. And so Jeff and I put our heads together and said, you want to try this? And he said, I'm from San Francisco and I'm a 49ers fan. And I said, well, I'm from Cleveland and I've been a Browns fan. But I said, I think we can both put ourselves across as NFL fans. And we both love being here with the Bengals doing this well. He's lived in town for, I think, close to 20 years. So we did. And we each wrote, it's a 6-chapter book. We each wrote 3 chapters. And then we traded and, edited one another's writing.
At the same time. So that's how we write the book in 5 weeks.
Yeah. So that worked. And because we were good editors of one another, we ended up, it doesn't sound like, well, this sounds like Rick wrote this and Jeff wrote that. And
you sure it doesn't sound like a 49ers and a Browns fan?
No, it doesn't. It absolutely does not. Even though it was the 49ers.
In 80 and 88.
That's right, who they played in those games. Uh-huh. But no, I think you would read it and be hard-pressed to find any. Well, I did do a little bit about the Browns because, well, Paul Brown really did get his start with the Cleveland Browns.
He was the coach for the Bengals, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And the owner. I mean, he's the guy who started the team.
Yep.
It's Mike Brown is his son. He's running the team now.
Did he start out as coaching at the Browns? And then
he started out coaching football in high school
in
Massillon, Ohio, state championship. Went on to Ohio State, won a Big Ten championship, then went to Cleveland and won a couple of NFL championships there.
What do you know?
Yeah. But then he was mistreated by Art Modell, the evil owner of the Browns, who fired him. And Paul said, all right.
Who are the Baltimore Colts?
I'm going to go start my own team.
Yeah.
Came down here and put the franchise together.
Why? You mentioned the Twin Cities earlier.
Yeah.
So they're in the same state. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's why they're respected as the Twin Cities. In northern Kentucky, those of us that grew up on this side.
Yeah.
I don't even know if we qualify as the redheaded stepchild. It's like we're the unnamed child. We keep trying to carve out our own culture and our identity. But it seems like we're fighting against the big brother all the time. Pull together this, because we're 25% of Cincinnati.
Yeah.
Explain this.
Well, I think some of it is because the German culture did not stay north of the river. There's plenty of it here in northern Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And so there are not some of those kind of distinctions. I think in Minneapolis and St. Paul, it's more Scandinavian in Minneapolis, and it's more Germanic in St. Paul. So there's some of that kind of ethnic distinction between the two. But I don't know. Beyond that, I don't have a ready answer. I try not to draw those kind of distinctions. I spent part of my working career I worked at Northern Kentucky University. I was the first general manager, WNKU, and
Rick, people ask me where I'm from.
Yeah, and you say Cincinnati.
Well, I try to say Northern Kentucky, and they're just like, where?
Yeah, right.
They think Kentucky. They think the stereotypical Kentucky. I'm like,
right.
guys, I'm from a metropolitan area.
You wear shoes? Yeah.
We're inside the loop.
Yeah, right. Well, some of those poor people who fly here and land at that airport and they say, welcome to Kentucky, and they think, did I get on the wrong flight?
What has happened to me?
Yeah. I think that is evolving, though. I think there's so much good stuff that's happening here in northern Kentucky. I mean, my gosh, the NKU's basketball team made it into March Madness this year.
Listen, they've been performing better than the UC Bearcats.
They beat them this year. So, yeah, I think, and again, there goes your question earlier about sports and civic pride and that sort of thing. I think that, there's some of that. But, my gosh, there's some high school football teams over here in Kentucky that are, every bit the equal of, some of the big teams in Ohio.
The St. X's, the Elders, the Mollers.
Yeah.
Over here we have Highlands and Covcath and Beechwood and all those guys.
Yeah.
So give us a final parting shot of your books, the city, Sondheim, everything we've talked about. Give us a 2023 full encapsulation of who you are and what you've been doing and what you've done thus far.
Well, I guess I'm somebody who has indulged in a lot of things that I really care about, which includes the city, its history. It includes theater and the arts. It includes musical theater, believe it or not. I've had people say to me, wait a minute, you're the guy who did that book about Sondheim. You wrote a book about football, too? So I guess I'm kind of omnivorous in all the things that I've done, but they're all things that I'm enthusiastic about. And I feel like my writing, I said this about theater, but a lot of it is that I want people to go to see theater. I've done all these things because I want people to go and enjoy stuff that's around town. I want them to go and find historic stuff around the city. I want them to go to Bengals games and be proud of the history of the team. That's a lot what Jeff and I, because we're both more historians than sports writers, we're sports fans. I mean, we could write about, a great game that, something happened in, but we as much tried to put things in an historic context. Cincinnati is a city that's worth being from, worth being proud of, worth coming to live in, and I hope that all my books accomplish some of that.
In the final passing word, what is Rick Pender's purpose of life?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. Keep on writing, I guess.
It's good enough for us.
Thank you.
Thanks for the time today. This was awesome.
My pleasure.
All right, go buy his book, guys. Go do some fun things around the city. 99 of them, not all 100 things to do before you die, because he's told me if I do them all, I might die. Thanks a lot, Rick.
There's nothing left to live for.
Thank you.